Here's I think one of the strengths that we anticipate being a strength of this team that maybe people might question, and I think is more debatable in my opinion. And when people question that, it would actually, make some sense. I actually think linebacker is going to be a strength of a football team this year.
I agree.
Now, last year the linebackers were just solid. They were solid but unspectacular, and they had some big mistakes, big misses. You think of Jack Kaiser getting beat down the seam in the bowl game. You think of J.D. Bertrand's missed tackles against North Carolina and USC and Oklahoma State. You think of the lack of big play production, lack of tackles for loss, lack of sacks, lowest numbers they've had in tackles for loss at linebacker in several seasons. And so those are concerns, right? But it was at least some steady, they were solid. They definitely were not what I would consider a strength. Well, that's those guys from last year are coming back this year. But the reason that I think it's going to be a strength is three reasons. One, Jack Kaiser, more experience playing that position, is going to be better. You have better depth at the position now that Jordan Patelho has a year at that position, and the arrival of Jalen Sneed. Because last year they lost Paul Moala, I think, like in the opener, and he was expected to be the number 2 rover. And so you lost your depth there, and you had to move Jeremiah. Now Jeremiah has all that time under his belt. Or Jordan Patelho, And then you have Jalen Sneed. J.D. Bertrand moves to Mike, which I think fits him better. So it's not like J.D.'s just coming back to the same position. I think he's going to move. He now has a full year under his belt. He had very, very little playing time going into last year and went out and had 100 tackles. We talked about the solo stop numbers, which were impressive. Only Jalen Smith and Manti Te'o in the last decade have had more. And so actually you'd have to go beyond a decade if you technically want to look at it, because the year Manti had more was in 2011, which is a little over 10 seasons prior to 2021. And so I think he's going to be better, but if he's not, there's 2 guys there that will beat him out, right? Sure. If he's not better, it's what we expect Maris Luafau to be, and then Prince Kollie, now a sophomore, and then the arrival of the freshman class. All those things to me combine for me to have a lot of confidence in this group. Plus, it's not just Marcus Freeman coaching them now. You've got Al Golden replacing Marcus Freeman. Al Golden was coaching linebackers in the National Football League last year, and the linebackers were a strength of that defense. I mean, Jermaine Pratt, it's Logan Wilson, right? I keep forgetting the kid from Utah, or from Wyoming, I mean. He was part of that group. He did a great job with that unit from, as I kind of went back and looked at it and have talked to different people that cover the team. He did a great job coaching the linebackers, and you've added James Laurinaitis, who's going to be working with the linebackers a lot too. So there's the coaching should be just as strong as it was, sure, if not better, because you have a better assistant to the coordinator, where Marcus Freeman was always kind of split between the linebacker, and you had Nick Lazinski, who did a nice job. But I think now you've got Freeman and those 2 coaches. So it's just the 3 of them together. So it's not that Marcus and Nick Lazinski didn't do a good job, or that I think that Al and James will be better than they were. It's just they will be good, and now but you still have Marcus. And trust me, Marcus Freeman's not going to just stop paying attention to the linebacker position. It's impossible. You can't do it. I've tried, right? I mean, even when I was coaching receivers, I'm like, what are the quarterbacks over there doing? I mean, it's just part of the deal. So I have a great deal of expectation for this unit. I think the talent is there. I think it's a very athletic unit. If J.D. Bertrand is your least athletic starting linebacker, or if you want to say it's Jack Kaiser, you have an athletic group of linebackers. Because I've heard people question J.D. Bertrand's athleticism. That is the last thing I'm concerned about with J.D. Bertrand. He's a really good athlete. He's just not very tall, and he's short-armed, right? That's the issue. But athleticism for J.D., not the problem. But his athleticism will only play up at Mike compared to where it was at Will, because he won't have to be in space as much, which is where his length could get exposed. And so that's why I have a great deal of confidence in this linebacking core. I perceive it to be a strength going into fall camp. Ryan, what say you?
Yeah, I would say that, I mean, first of all, I guess if I wanted to just kind of comment on the J.D. Bertrand, I mean, you mentioned, Brian, he had some missed tackles last year, and I think that's more a length thing than it is an athleticism perspective. There can be some players that are just late to getting to a spot because they're not great athletes, but I think when you watch J.D. Bertrand, he was always in the right spot. It just seemed like tackle radius isn't huge, right? He's got shorter arms. He doesn't have the greatest range from a tackler perspective, not necessarily from a foot quickness perspective.
Right.
So I think that Maris Luafau is the he's the player that can upgrade two positions potentially, right? If he's the player that we think he is, then he's going to upgrade what the Will linebacker was last year. And JD was good, Will, but we agree. He's going to be a better Mike than Will, in my opinion. So you're going to upgrade the Will position if Maris is what we think he is with that combination of length and athleticism. You're also going to upgrade the Mike because now you don't have to pigeonhole, excuse me, you don't have to pigeonhole a JD Bertrand in at Will anymore. He can pop over to a more natural Mike position where that length is not going to matter quite as much as it did playing a lot more in space, to your point. So you upgrade two positions, and now you have to not hope, but you have to expect that Jack Kaiser is going to be a better football player than he was last year. Because I didn't necessarily think Jack was like bad or anything.
He was similar to JD, where he was a good, solid football player that made some big plays, but there were some teams that were fast enough and or long enough where he could get into matchup problems because of his lack of length. Like Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah was about the same height as Jack Kaiser, but Jeremiah is really long. Jack's not as long. Jack is also a really good athlete. It's just there are some matchups, and especially since you didn't really have safeties that could protect as well. That's something Notre Dame lacked last year at safety, which we'll talk about tomorrow.
Sure.
As being a question mark, although we think Brandon Joseph could be an answer to that, but he's got to show it, and we don't know how he's going to be used, some different things that we'll discuss. But he was put in the island a lot more, I think, than you ideally would want him to. In most matchups, he's fine. Sure. But there were some times when teams were able to get taller slots or tight ends on him and 3x1s where even though Jack was in good coverage, he was getting beat because the lack of length.
Yeah.
And so same thing there. And so, but to your point, I think now that with a year under his belt, Ryan, he'll be better positioned to say, hey, I know that I can't let myself get beat here because of my lack of length. So let me play this differently. That's where experience comes into play.
100%.
And now the staff knows, okay, Jack is really good in these areas, but hey, look, he can get in trouble in this one area. So let's make sure that we're mindful of not putting him in those situations unless we know he has help. Right. Mm-hmm. And so, look, if he's going to be cover number 3, then, maybe your safety's helping over 1 or 2, but make sure you're playing some kind of coverage where your backside safety is now going to protect and roll to the middle where he can protect both of the seams when Jack's in coverage. Sure. Whereas if you want to outrun Jack to the perimeter, go for it. Wisconsin tried that, right? And when you look at when Graham Mertz threw that ball, he saw Jack there. He's like, there's no way this guy can get to this ball. That's why he threw it. And he was wrong because Jack can run.
He's very
right. And so those are the times when Jack is really good, when he can just run. But if you get him in a vertical coverage against a taller player, that's when he can get in trouble with a quarterback with some ball placement ability. And they will face those this year.
Yeah.
And so that was so I liked Jack last year. He was a solid, steady player. He's going to improve, I think. JD is going to improve, but we expect them to have a dude. And I think that's kind of where my optimism comes from this unit when I look at the strength. And I also think that this unit is going to it's going to play off better with the front maybe than last year, because I think Drew was really good. He was really smart and heady, and Drew could run pretty decently as well. He ran a 4.6 something at the pro day. That's pretty good for a middle linebacker. It's not necessarily ideal for a guy that's 6'1", 220,
sure,
right? But he could run okay. But he wasn't a great, in my opinion, stunter or blitzer. And I think JD is a lot more impactful in that regard. The problem was JD would get there and then just miss because of the lack of length. And again, I think as a Mike, he's going to be a little bit more protective because he's not going to be in space as much. But, I think he's going to be more impactful coming downhill. He's got more vertical explosiveness than Drew White had. And he's got, to me, even more size and length than Drew White had at that position. So I think we're going to see more big play production there. And again, if he does it, then Bo will be out there or Junior will be out there. And they're going to be part of it anyway. Sure. But then when you add the Marist aspect to it, that's where your big play production is going to come. And that's more than anything, that's where Notre Dame been hurt the last couple of years, because they didn't have that in 2020 either. Even Asmar in 2019 provided 10 tackles for loss. Asmar was good at will in 2020. And then
Yep.
2019 2019. And then in 2018, of course, Drew Tranquil was stud. That, I mean, the two inside
Baller.
backers in 2018 were studs. Marist, Asmar had some really good moments in 2019, but in 2020, the will linebacker position was a problem. It was, in my opinion, the biggest problem on defense. And it was two different reasons. You had one guy that did his job precisely every time, but he made no plays because he had no feel for the game. That's Shane Simon. Made no plays. The other guy was incredibly athletic and rangy, but he was like inconsistent with his execution. That's Marist. So there were times Marist looked great in 2020. And the other times you're like, dude, where are you going? Like,
Right.
Where are you? Now you hope that now with some time under his belt that Marist be that big time playmaker, but now be more steady because they need to get more big time production from that position. This defense is built towards the will line, and really most defenses now. It used to be the Mike. Now, like maybe not from a pure tackle standpoint, but from a big play standpoint, your will has got to be your position where you're getting that stuff now.
Will's the playmaker. You're 100% correct in that regard. And we obviously were expecting Marist to take the jump last year before the injury. I think honestly, Brian, like I'm going to use like the blessing in disguise thing for a second, right? Marist being able to just kind of see the game from a year from a different vantage point might be beneficial for him. We'll see kind of how all that works out. But my biggest thing, and you mentioned it briefly, I feel great about the second level of this defense because there's a lot of depth here, man. Like there's a lot. You just mentioned it with Mike linebacker. If JD's not playing up to caliber, up to what you're expecting, up to what his talent dictates, then you have guys like Bo Bauer and Junior Tuihalamaka that are waiting in the wings and are very capable and talented football players. At will linebacker, Prince Kali is a very talented football player. At Rover, I'm kind of excited about the Rover position because we have three completely different types at Rover that are ready to go here, right? Jack Kaiser, good athlete, kind of instinctual type of player. And then you have, a guy, Jalen Sneed's, going to fight for some spot time, but he is the more explosive athlete of the player. And then Jordan Botelho kind of has the best of both worlds, and he's got the background as a Viper. So when you want a Rover that can blitz off the edge a little bit, right, or could come off from the slot on a blitzer, man, Jordan Botelho in the game. And I think that you can mix and match those skill sets really well at the Rover position because all three are just so different. So the biggest thing for me is I think that Amaris Loifau can unlock the other players around him because he helps you in a couple different spots. But more than anything, I'm excited about the depth. There is so many talented football players, which I don't remember it being this deep in years past. I mean, I remember last year. It
hasn't been. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember last year when Maris got hurt, you're like, oh, well, I mean, JD Bertrand ended up being a good player, but like, I was like, oh man, can JD Bertrand play Will? He doesn't really look like a Will linebacker to me. And, we're kind of like, he probably is more of a Mike than a Will, which is why we're excited about it. But the point is if, God forbid, somebody gets hurt, you're like, oh, there's a dude behind him, like these guys can play a little bit. Right. So, I mean, we're in a situation where Jalen Sneed is so talented, but yet he's not guaranteed to play much in 2022 because the depth is just so high in front of him right now.